It's been 11 months since the proxy war between NATO and Russia on the territory of Ukraine began in February of 2022. Over the past week, there's been a renewed call for even more arms to be sent to Ukraine from the West. And we discussed that with analyst Mark Sleboda, a senior lecturer at Moscow State University. We asked him, what does it mean going forward, and what's happened over the past year?
If you've been paying attention for the last week or two, you notice that there is an increasing amount of desperation and urgency in providing more and better and bigger weapons to the U.S.-backed Kiev regime in Ukraine. All of a sudden, there has been a sea change in the way that the current state of the conflict is being reported. It hasn't so much been outright admitted that things are not going well for the Kiev regime, but that is the inevitable conclusion with the increasing desperation in the calls for new weapons. And principal among those that are being called for are air defense systems and Western main battle tanks. They are attempting to assemble in the middle of the conflict a third military, a third armed forces for Ukraine. A third one. Why a third one? Because there have been two previous militaries that the Ukraine has had worth of equipment and troops to operate them in this conflict that have already been destroyed in the last year. Now, the Kiev regime started out this conflict with a fairly powerful military, probably the second most powerful military in continental Europe after Russia, and that is pretty significant. We know from Macron and Merkel and Poroshenko that the whole goal of the Minsk Accords, and for years from 2015 on, we heard that the Minsk Accords were the only way forward, and they just needed to be implemented, and there was no other alternative. And now we know that they never intended to fulfill them at all, that this was all a deception in order to build up a powerful Ukrainian military. Because when the Kiev regime seized power in 2014, the military was completely non-responsive. That's why they had the need to form the far-right battalions off the Maidan to send to try to subjugate the Donbass. The Kiev regime started out the conflict with a large military, mostly of Soviet legacy equipment, but that was fairly modernized and was peppered. And they had received large amounts of NATO training and planning and reorganization of their military. And they started out the conflict with 2,500 some tanks, 12,000 armored vehicles, meaning infantry fighting vehicles and APCs, 60 fighter aircraft, and some 30 attack helicopters and another 300 combat drones and the like. That's a pretty significant military.
Yeah.
And the one thing that we know from this conflict is that the Soviet legacy equipment, especially when it has been modernized, is actually still fairly powerful on the
Pretty good
battlefield.
stuff, right?
That military was destroyed by the summer. And we know that there was a big call to send arms to Ukraine. And the second military they formed was all of the Soviet legacy equipment gathered from all of the former Warsaw Pact and Yugoslav countries that also had Soviet legacy equipment, right? Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, Slovakia, all these countries, they had large amounts of Soviet legacy equipment. a large portion of which had been modernized over the last couple of decades, reactive armor for the tanks and so forth. And they shoveled it all into Ukraine. Hundreds of more tanks, many hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles and APCs, armored vehicles, artillery pieces, artillery shells, everything, MiGs, everything that they could send. And this was peppered with some more advanced Western modern equipment, the M777 howitzers, the HIMARS, right? And they received even more NATO training and funding and ammunition and the like. That army was also destroyed, and that army was destroyed during the much vaunted Ukrainian counteroffensives in Kherson and Kharkov, where they advanced, particularly in Kherson, across open steppe with large numbers of infantry, mechanized infantry and the like, but nothing else. And Russia, they're fighting a war of attrition. Right, whereas the Kiev regime is fighting a war of a territorial maneuver.
Right.
So Russia simply withdrew, and they kept hitting the Ukrainian forces as they withdrew. So it actually played very well into Russian hands. Now they're screaming for more. And the escalation cycle is now all the way up to Western main battle tanks, right? Patriot air defense systems. But unfortunately, when they're talking 14 Challenger tanks, right? Because that's all that's been promised in the way of tanks. And Germany keeps saying that it won't provide Leopard tanks, and it won't give permission for other European countries to provide their Leopards unless the U.S. sends their Abrams. And the U.S. says they won't send their Abrams because they're completely inappropriate, which they are. Western main battle tanks are very different to operate from Soviet systems, Soviet legacy systems, because they don't have autoloaders, which means you need an extra tank member, a loader, which completely changes the dynamic of the tank team. Right. And they require different types of ammunition, and they can't be repaired in Ukraine because the Ukrainians can't repair them and they don't have the parts for them. They would then have to be dragged all the way across the Ukraine from the front into Poland and Slovakia to be repaired if they can. The U.S. knows that these are completely inappropriate and would be completely wasted and wouldn't actually do the Kiev regime much good. They think the Leopards would be slightly better. The Germans aren't buying it. And everyone doesn't know where to go from here because while they have promised large numbers of Bradleys, infantry fighting vehicles, APCs, strikers, and the like, that's good. That's a mechanized infantry, but on its own, it's not a military. And without a heavy offensive power, the U.S. has run out of artillery pieces that send them. They're only sending a couple dozen artillery pieces. And when it comes to shells for the artillery, right, the Kiev regime, we know from their own sources, they're firing 5,000 to 6,000 artillery shells a day, whereas the Russians are firing 50,000 to 60,000 artillery shells a day. The U.S. makes 30,000 artillery shells a year.
Wow.
That's a week's supply, right? And the U.S. is so desperate. They've depleted all their own stockpiles. They're drawing on stockpiles now that they have built up in Israel and South Korea for decades in preparation for conflicts in the Middle East or against North Korea. And they're basically, we need all this. Sorry. We'll give it back to you sometime in the future.
The beast is defanging itself before our very eyes.
Right now, they're not just demilitarizing Ukraine, and they're not just demilitarizing all the Soviet legacy equipment that Gorbachev stupidly left behind in Europe. They're now demilitarizing NATO globally itself. And they don't know where to go from here because there's not many escalation steps up. And nothing has changed the inevitable course of the conflict. Whatever they're talking about sending now is only a fraction of what Ukraine had to start this conflict with. And the questionable small degree in improvement in quality does not in any way make up for the huge remove in quantity that they have already lost in this conflict. All this is going to do is keep the Kiev regime throwing forced conscripts into the conflict for another half a year And then what?
And then what? And that's the question of the day. Mark, thank you so much. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you, Don. Thanks for having me.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.